The Three Wise Fools podcast is brought to you by the Public Health South Tees Borough Can Men's Health campaign. However, we feel we should make it clear that the pod, the content and the opinions expressed within are not necessarily representative of Public Health South Tees or its associated local authorities, Middlesbrough or Redcar and Cleveland Borough Councils. We do this in our own time and enjoy the freedom to talk about the issues in our way. So enjoy the pod and visit www.boroughmancan.co.uk to find out more.
My first question would be, it's a daft icebreaker. What was the last gig you went to, or the last album you listened to?
Probably Beyonce's Lemonade.
Oh, nice.
That's a bit girly, isn't it? Sorry.
There's nothing wrong with that.
I love the fact that it's like proper. Some parts of it are like her absolute anger and like, because it's all about obviously the affair.
Mm-hmm.
And other parts about them putting themselves back together. So it's actually like storytelling within the album.
Yeah.
It's just so good. Like you have to listen to it a lot of times to get the different layers of the depth of it.
I've never listened to it, but I was interested by the concept. Jay-Z.
Jay-Z.
With Rita Ora by all accounts, Richie.
Was it? I don't know who it was. I just know it was Becky with the good hair
Yeah,
from the song.
that's apparently Rita Ora.
Allegedly.
Apparently so, yeah. Allegedly.
Yeah.
I mean, the word on the street is. But yeah, so they had this thing and they've worked through it all. He worked through it in his album. She worked through it in her album. And they talk about how he's a flawed person in terms of, because he's still Jay-Z.
Yeah.
He wrote songs called Big Pimpin', Girls, Girls, Girls.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, you know,
He did put a ring on it.
He apparently did put a ring on it.
Yeah.
But it was just fascinating that the strength of someone like Beyonce, the strength of any person to be able to take that, digest that information, and then make music about it, and the strength of him to be okay with the fact she's making music about that. It's a really interesting dynamic. It's a powerful dynamic.
It's kind of the opposite of what's happened with I was going to say Kanye West and Kim Kardashian.
That's a scary situation because
I think he's very well.
No, I don't think
that's what I mean. People openly judge him. He shouldn't be doing that, but he's clearly an unwell man. He's clearly got really severe mental. I mean, he's diagnosed as bipolar.
So, did you see his interview on Joe Rogan?
No, I couldn't watch it. I couldn't bring myself to watch it.
He seems to ride that gap between sort of unhinged and brilliant creative quite scarily, you know.
Yeah. There's things he's doing now are borderline on high school obsession.
Yeah.
Like...
Yeah, the new video with burying her new boyfriend in a video and stuff.
Yeah.
See, I haven't seen... To be honest, Kanye West, I was a massive Kanye West fan.
Huge for me, yeah.
The early
big
stuff.
important for me.
You know, the Late Registration? That was like one
his
of my
whole college
all-time
trilogy,
idols. But then when he got iller, I actually couldn't bring myself to watch what he was doing because I felt so sorry for him and worried about him. And like you said, just kind of sad that the whole world is judging him. And actually he's clearly not very well.
Not at all well.
And where's that compassion and where's that trying to get him some help?
I think because he's so self-sufficient and so strong, if he wasn't so famous and in the public eye, if he was one of us, someone would take him in, they would say, here you go.
Right.
But because he's seen as powerful and independent, maybe he just doesn't want to, and he's got the money to not ever need it. I think
it's America as well, because over here, like, there's a lot of legislation and stuff about looking after people. So, you know, like Michael Jackson would not have had the surgery he had here because nobody would have done that.
What surgery did you have? Oh, the skin surgery.
Not just that, but I mean just the extreme plastic surgery.
Anything you want, as long as you can pay for it.
Oh, it's a commercialised surgery.
That's right.
Yeah, so like, whereas like even in the UK, even if you had all that money, just ethically and like, you know, just keep your license, you wouldn't be allowed to do that to somebody, do you know what I mean, who clearly needs a psychological support to accept themselves rather than being made into a white man. Do you know what I mean? So
that's right.
I think like whereas in America, like you say, if you've got enough money, do whatever you want.
Yeah.
It's terrifying.
Isn't it just? And didn't Kanye West, he jumped up on stage at an awards thing and started saying...
I've done it a few times.
Someone else, yes.
The famous one was the Taylor Swift one.
Oh, that was it.
See, I know you didn't expect me to be so on like R&B and foreign affairs.
No, mate, I'm into everything. All music.
It was Taylor Swift won an award. I think it was one of her first major awards, and he got up and said, I'm happy for you, but you're not Beyonce. She deserves this award. Like, took her moment off her.
Oh, that's brutal.
But again, now that it's come out how ill he is, it doesn't surprise me.
No, but I think he rides that, like I said, that thing between genius and sort of that creative element. And
his first 4 or 5 albums were phenomenally good.
Yeah,
absurdly good. I'm still a huge fan.
He's invested in like lots of other businesses as well. Like he's quite the entrepreneur as well. Like once he's got the money, he's invested in lots of other things.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Adele as well. Like she had a breakup, quite a public breakup, didn't she, with the husband? And then she lost all the weight, and that was like the focus of the media, wasn't it?
But she got stuff for that as well. She got stick for losing weight. conforming to Hollywood.
Yeah, everything's
standards,
outraged.
like,
Depends where you go, isn't it? It's on
insane.
Twitter.
There was that running joke, wasn't there? There's no iller fate for a man than being Adele's ex-boyfriend. He'll just get rinsed in the public eye.
I know. I dare say it probably wasn't the only relationships that have had difficulties during the last couple of years.
Nah.
With like the pandemic and the the lockdowns and all the different restrictions we've had to live under. It's been a weird time, has it not?
It really has, yeah.
So we should do some introductions. So we're talking Alex Jones, Dr. Alex Jones, I should say, not the Alex Jones from InfoWars. That's the one extreme end.
Not the psychotic American.
Not the psycho American who has some valid stuff, but you've got to look for it, haven't you? Basically, and then you've got Welsh Alex Jones, who I find a bit bland. So the other end of the scale is kind of like sort of like the one show, kind of like delivering that lifestyle magazine type.
A bit
show.
of a human blancmange.
Human blancmange. And then we've got Dr. Alex Jones in front of us.
Yeah.
Who,
Best of everything.
We were joking about where on that scale would you fall.
Yeah, the Alex Jones scale.
Yeah.
See, frighteningly, probably more towards InfoWars, man.
Yeah,
It's just awful,
Fine.
isn't it?
He's a terrifying human. Like you said, he's got some valid points.
Oh, yes.
But
I
when
don't
he's
think there's
saying
any valid points to see.
no,
No, I think he's insane.
Yeah, he throws a lot of stuff out there, and I think if you throw a lot of stuff out there, you get
something's going to stick.
Yeah, something's going to
But
stick. Yeah.
he might have some. When I take valid points, I mean in terms of some of the more conspiratorial stuff. There might be validity in that in and of itself, but when he's delivering it behind a message of they're trying to turn the frogs gay,
Yeah.
like how can you take any of that with any kind of sincerity?
I know, yeah. I haven't seen the research on that one.
No, it's not very well
Yeah.
published. The abstract's really weak.
That's right. I didn't even
Can a
realise.
frog be gay? Because I thought they could change
Exactly.
gender.
And then
Oh,
what's
yeah.
that, asexual or something? Is that what you call it? But
No, asexual is where you just don't have a sexual identity. I
oh,
think.
there you go.
If they're
maybe
under
you
enough
get-
pressure, they can change sex, can't they? So they can continue to breed. Like you put a load of male
Yeah.
frogs together.
See, that's why.
You've never seen Jurassic
That's why
Park?
you're a doctor.
Yeah.
And
Well, I'm probably
The
wrong.
references.
Someone's going
Yeah.
to be like writing in and saying,
Yeah.
what?
some can
I'm not as vet.
I can't remember which animal it is, but one can actually, self impregnate. Yeah. And I don't know if it's a frog. No. Oh, there you go. So we've covered turning the frogs gay.
Yeah.
So you're somewhere in the middle, but probably leaning slightly more towards that. And we had a good catch up, didn't we? Like just a few weeks ago, chatting about kind of doing this. And so this is very much about kind of, we were looking for a GB to talk about mental health, about men's mental health, about the problems kind of with men accessing support in the first place. Once they do, what type of support works for them and how it is different. And you volunteered to do this. And I know you've recently been interviewed as well for the James Arthur documentary that's going to be going out on the BBC quite soon as well. So obviously that's obviously quite a good interview to do. I feel like this is going to be your moment of fame though, really. That's just another one. That's just another
That was the
interview.
warm up, maybe.
That was the warm up, yeah.
What? It's a total aside. That documentary that's coming out, is it from James Arthur's perspective with his struggles with mental illness, or is he more the interviewer? Do you know what I mean? I'd be
I
interested to
understand
see
that he's doing like interviews. It's like his journey of exploration of the area of like mental health
Okay.
and his experiences. And I don't think his experiences with antidepressants were very positive, were they? And I think that's all he was offered, really. I don't think he was offered a lot of other
I
solutions.
think he stopped them cold turkey and got quite unwell.
Wow.
And had like a poorly year because of how he'd stopped them. So there was some conversation that we had about, obviously, that's not how you stop antidepressants sort of thing, and a bit of chat around that as well.
Yeah.
And I think he's kind of questioning whether if he went on antidepressants it would affect his creativity, because we've talked about Kanye West.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think he's worried that he'll just become like numb and he will lose that,
Mhm.
Wow.
the thing that makes him who he is, sort of thing.
Absolutely. That's fascinating.
I'm still on antidepressants, but when I lived in Basingstoke,
You are
London-
now?
Yeah.
How long have you been on antidepressants?
Oh God, essentially, barring 1 year interruption since I was about 19 years old.
Right, okay.
Yeah,
All those years ago.
pretty much.
Yeah.
And when I moved back up here, I moved up here because life was hard. It kind of stabilised me to a degree.
From London.
Moved back up here around my family, better support system. So with the help of my doctor, I weaned myself off them. Under his guidance, of course.
Yeah.
45 milligrams of mirtazapine down to 30, down to 15, and then off. And then I crashed. And I've got no idea whether that's because my body's been used to antidepressants all this time, or whether I've got a real legitimate chemical imbalance.
Yeah.
But in my experience, it was trial and error finding the right one. I went through fluoxetine and citalopram and a few different others.
Uh-huh.
And one of them completely modulated all of my emotions.
Right.
So extreme highs, extreme lows, they just had the tops and bottoms cut off. So you exist in this kind of middle band between the two.
Mhm.
So I can understand him
Stabilising
saying
mood,
that. Yeah,
if you like,
I was stable, but I just wasn't the same anymore.
Does that seem to be the main justification for them, like mood stabilising then?
Yeah, I think a a lot of people need to feel like more in control of their emotions, and I think the problem is that lots of people have to still function, don't they, in their day-to-day life, and I think that's why, that's my personal opinion about why antidepressants are on the up.
Okay.
Because what people probably need is a break. But can you afford to have a few months off work, or can you, whatever your commitments might be in life, like my 3 children aren't going to go anywhere, like I still need to look after them, and obviously various other things you can imagine. And if those pressures are not going to go, and that's why part of the reason you're really struggling, then sometimes people just need to be a little bit numb in order to keep going.
Yeah, there's no pill just for life and the adversities that it can throw you.
Yeah.
That's the difficulty, isn't it?
Sorry, based on that, should those kind of medications be time constrained?
I mean, to be fair, you are supposed to have a regular review. Like, the idea isn't supposed to be go on it forever. On the same note, there's lots of evidence that when you go on it, you need to spend a decent period on it feeling well. Yeah. So, like the first depressive episode, it should be at least 6 months of feeling good. And it's probably not a very good analogy because I don't know anything about cars, but I say, it's almost like your brain's got to run well for a while before you take away that support.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because what happens is people just feel better after a month and they're so desperate to come straight off it, back down again. So before I even start anybody on one, that's part of the chat. Like, it's going to be at least 6 months of feeling good. So if it takes 2 months to feel good, then it's 6 months after that.
Yeah.
And then if it's another episode, then you're supposed to stay on it for maybe 2 years. But I guess the real crux of the problem is this huge volume genuinely depressive episodes, or is this us medicating life? And I think that's the actual real question, which is more difficult to pull out, isn't it?
We've talked about it this morning of the level of anxiety in 2022, social anxiety, world anxiety. It's something maybe I'm just becoming more politicized than I was as a kid, but I've never experienced anything like this before in terms of what people have been going through. The fear, the social fear, it's almost unbearable. It just keeps this bubbling under the surface, imbalance in your anxiety that is triggered into an extreme episode so very easily.
So we have to acknowledge, obviously, the last 2 years has been difficult. We have been through a pandemic, and when we sort of attribute some of the impacts upon mental health as being from COVID, what we're really saying is actually, when you look deeper at it, it's from the policies and the measures that were brought in. And this is not about debating the sort of the effect, the effect of those or how useful they were, and there's various studies out there to talk about that. But clearly, the net effect of it has been, in terms of lockdowns and impact on livelihood and kind of the people having to readjust and recover from that, a massive effect on mental health, and particularly when fear has been used as a tool to encourage, to nudge people's behaviours, which is obviously, very overt in terms of how it's been done. That's had probably a permanent effect sometimes.
A huge effect. But I don't even mean simply COVID and lockdown. I mean the way the media has everything. And maybe the solution would be turn your TV off.
But there's things about that, isn't it? People talk about, like, you don't just manage what you're eating, manage what you're consuming from media.
100%. Your media consumption habits. But it's everything, whether it's the George Floyd murder or COVID or now the war and any of the other 400 different events whereby there's no moderation anymore, there's no centrism. You're either in camp A or camp B, and then you fight between yourselves. That level of division, especially on social media. I know it's a hot button to say social media is the problem, but you lose friends, you lose family, your relationships with people become, do you believe all of these things that I believe in? If not, you're out. The trans rights, whatever it may be, it's there's no common discourse anymore.
But then part of that is the nature of communicating on social media. So if I say something to you now that you don't agree with, you can see my body language, you can see my posture, you can see my intention in what I'm saying, and you might think, well, okay, I don't agree with that, but she's clearly saying it from a place of compassion or whatever. If I type that, you don't know whether I'm shouting it at you, whether I'm getting aggressive. And so, it does kind of kill, your ability to, I don't know, have a proper discussion.
No, I agree. I totally agree. Yeah.
How true is that?
And I don't know what the solution is to that. We can't have,
less
regular
exposure.
social forums where people come together and discuss their ideas, as nice as that would be.
Yeah, I mean, there's a documentary, wasn't there? I think it's one on Netflix. I'm trying to remember the name of it, but it's about the attention economy, basically, and how notifications keep popping up on your screen and so on, and actually the damaging effect of that. It's been quite well documented now, in terms of kind of I think it's the amygdala in your brain, and it reaches basically straight into there. It's producing an emotional
reward system.
Yeah. I think that's amygdala, but anyway, regardless, it's your reward system. And so what you're getting is almost like this encouragement to get quick boost of feeling good, which is like everything else has a drop, doesn't it? Has a crash afterwards, when it can have the opposite effect when you're not getting the notifications, when you're not getting the likes, and so on and so on.
I think the thing is that actually we're designed to have social interaction face to face, but what happens is we crave social interaction, we go on social media and we're like, okay, so we've had that social interaction, but it actually doesn't do as good the same way it does to meet face to face. So then actually you kind of fooled yourself into thinking you've had that social interaction. Like even friends, like I have friends who live from uni who like live all over the country. Probably see them as much as the friends who live local, because you don't make the effort, because you think, oh well, I've seen the kids' photos and I've seen whatever on social media. Whereas if that social media didn't exist, you would make the effort to pick up the phone. You'd say, oh, I haven't seen them for months, I better find out what's going on. But you kind of think it you do because you saw what they had for dinner or whatever.
So it's a trade. So you think it's like it's perceived to be a trade-off for something which is the same, but actually the reality is it's not, and it's stripping up of something that we need, that we're not getting as much of, which is that social interaction. Now that's a huge when it came to lockdowns, in terms of kind of, we know you put rats in a cage and kind of what happens, and essentially I saw it as being the same thing. Is it kind of like right from the start, why are we so surprised that the net effect has been so so impactful on people's mental health? People I've known who have never experienced any mental health symptoms talk about kind of feeling anxious about going out, doing the normal things like masking up, whatever it would be. What rules they're meant to be following now, because things are changing so rapidly. But if you're someone who's already anxious, already had mental health issues, this is like pushed you down the road.
Oh, 100%.
Which is potentially unnecessary.
But more to your point, Dr. Jones, that when you say about your friends who don't see each other very frequently, and despite how close they are, I've got a few very, very precious friendship groups whereby you go to their house and that's what you do. You're at their house, really welcoming, calm spaces. They'll come to us for a little bit, we'll go to theirs for a weekend, we'll sit and have a coffee, and you don't look at your phones. It's not prescribed, it's just the way it is. And I find I crave those way, way more now. Because like I said, when I lived in Basingstoke, I lived on my own for 4 or 5 years. All my friends and family were up here, so you're tethered to your phone. That's your outlet to the world. And it creates some really, really unhealthy habits. Isolation does funny things to you.
Doesn't it?
Really funny things to you.
They've done studies, like you were saying, they've done it with people, locking up.
Yeah.
They've basically got normal, young, fit men, and they basically told them to become sedentary, like they could only do so many thousand steps, not very many. And they only did it for a couple of weeks, and by the end of the couple of weeks, a huge percentage of them had anxiety and depression symptoms after being normal. You know what I mean? Just by reducing how much exercise they could do. Down to a sedentary lifestyle, which we're kind of designing our world to make us completely sedentary, and then wondering why we're sad.
The idea of the idea of like a metaverse where everyone's wearing VR helmets, like the Ready Player One film and so on, terrifies me. I think that's dystopian to me. That feels like a future that it doesn't play to the very things that we know about well-being that keeps us well.
No.
So we need to like dissuade from that, don't we?
But that's something we've talked about before, whereby during lockdown I used to go to the gym quite a lot. During lockdown, they weren't open, so I took up just hiking and walking. Best thing for my mental health that I've had in years and years and years. And now if I had to live without that and that outlet and that comfort and however many adjectives you want to prescribe to it, it's been phenomenally beneficial.
There's actually something in nature, I think they're called fractals. I might have said that wrong. Essentially, it's like a certain shape that you only get in nature. So you get it in trees or in beaches, basically any type of nature. You don't get it in artificial things, and it's really good for your mental health. So there's something about being out in nature that's really good for you. And the other thing that is you know how you can control kind of your stress levels with breathing. Another thing that can control your stress levels is your gaze. So if you can put yourself on a long gaze rather than a close one, that actually can also send a signal that you can, like, you don't need to be on high alert. So obviously when you're out walking, you naturally look, because I've got a dog that was part of my stress relief in lockdown. Actually, it wasn't quite lockdown. After lockdown, we made the decision to do it. And I go on the beach and I'll consciously think, like, right, I'm going to look out and look at the cliff and look further away and just breathe in like that amazing atmosphere.
I took up fell walking after I'd just been around Rosebery Topping and through Errington Woods and things. I took up just driving to the lakes for the day on my own. And I'd never thought about it in those terms before, but sitting on the side of a fell and looking out as far as you can see, that makes a lot of sense.
That's threat reduction. Because if it's that kind of fight, freeze or flight reaction, if that's truly kind of like embedded in us from when we were kind of cavemen, wandering around but having always having that threat of like other animals. And
I'm
stuff.
freeze, by the way.
Makes sense. You're
I'm
freeze.
I've got no survival instincts whatsoever. I'll just stand still.
Lash out, but no, just stop mid idea.
Big hairy statue in the middle of the room.
So, Alex, you've got a personal interest as a professional interest in mental health as well. Can we start on your personal interest in mental health, and which came first? Did you have your own experiences with mental health first as you were training as a GP, or was it,
Probably looking back, to be honest, my mum had really significant mental health problems my entire life, but not anything that was ever official. That makes sense, but obviously looking back with professional eyes, I can see that was definitely true.
Okay.
And probably myself as well, but without realising it. Like, I definitely had social anxiety at university, but I didn't recognise what that was.
Wow.
And when I first moved away from home, like, I had a lot of, probably it was just like depression, just struggling to cope with not being near home and no support, and basically just being a bit immature and trying to survive when you're not with your family.
Okay.
But again,
do
not
it yourself. Like,
like it was a big shock to me. I don't think I realised how immature I was, and I had to suddenly now survive in this kind of grown-up world and look after yourself, and I wasn't quite ready for that. And I also had some friendship breakdowns at that point, so like that put my anxiety through the roof, and like your self-worth and all that kind of stuff. It was just a tough time for me. But again, I didn't recognise any of that at the time. And then I suppose personally was okay for a while, but when I came home here, so like the first couple of years of, I don't know whether you've watched that new show about junior doctors.
This is going to hurt.
Yeah, I mean, I've just started reading the book. I haven't watched it, but basically the first few years, the working are really awful. And if I didn't know it was going to end, I probably wouldn't have been a doctor still, because it's so stressful, and I think that made me quite unwell. And at the same time, my mum had her worst mental health breakdown. So like at the same time of trying to work this job, which is just unrelenting, and like 70, 90-hour weeks, like I was really worried my mum was going to commit suicide. So I was like, I was coming home and like just all the things that go with that, as well as being newly married, newly moved across the country. Like you name it. I did a lot of stressful things at once. But again, probably not with much insight. And then the big thing for me, when I realised I'd become unwell, is that I obviously had a couple of children, and I basically just got really bad postnatal depression. And at the time, again, see, it's funny because we talk about men's mental health. I think like we joke that I'm kind of like a man, because I don't really accept a lot of things, and it's all about like you just do your job and you just go to work, and quite a lot of my attitudes I think you would classify as male. Does that make sense?
Traits, like kind of this manning up the idea of like you've got to cope with it by yourself.
I think like quite a lot of the things that you would associate with the way men would behave, I think that's how I have behaved in my life.
Someone's talked to me about that kind of thing before. Like we joke about how we've got a really 50s relationship. I'll do the budget, she cleans the kitchen. Like, it's just the division of labours kind of happened that way. But she's a social worker, and she talks about this thing called compassion fatigue. And I'm a really weepy, soft, cry at films, really emotionally open person. And she's not, because she has to deal with that kind of thing all day, every day. So it gets shut down a little bit. So that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Do you know that?
I've never heard the term compassion fatigue before.
There was a study that's happened after the pandemic to show those people who are really deep horror fans, like fans of horror films, have been quite resilient in terms of like the limitations.
That makes sense.
Like, there's a whole thing about kind of conditioning, like social conditioning, and actually being used to or deliberately exposing yourself to things that are in safety but traumatic to watch, or do you know what I mean? And kind of being more resilient to it. But it's just an interesting
I'm useless
thing.
with horror films. I'm terrible.
Well, it's back to that exposure to it, isn't it? But you've had it, I mean, when I used to work in workplace health, there was like a stress points thing you could do, and it would be, if you scored over 100, there was varying degrees of how many points you would get. Like, and it was sort of risk of developing mental health problems or developing stress based on how many life events you had going on. And there's things on that list that you wouldn't think, like going on holiday should be a relaxing thing. Having a new baby, changing the job, studying, taking on a new career, and obviously having, supporting family members. Now, as you were describing that, I'm thinking like the stress bucket that we've talked about in mental health training, where it's like everyone has, their bucket can be a different size and what you chuck in there as well. It's a lot to deal with at once. So it shouldn't be that surprise. When you look back, you probably go, it makes sense.
It's funny actually, because like, even when I had postnatal depression, I was like, well, it's because I'm tired and I've had no sleep. Like, I don't think I ever thought I'm mentally ill. I was like, well, of course I am. You know what I mean? Like, I haven't slept in 6 months and all the other pressures that were there. So again, it took me quite a long time to actually seek help for that, because I kept waiting for it to get better. Like, when I get more sleep, I'll get better. And it makes me laugh, actually. I've said this a few times. Like, I went to the doctor, said, I think I've got postnatal depression. So, how old's the baby? I said, 2.
Yeah.
And it was like funny, but because it took me that long to say, actually, this is not going away.
Yeah.
Like, and things have changed, and yet I still feel the way I feel.
Were you practicing doctor at the time? Then?
Yeah.
So, were you a GP?
I was training to be a GP.
Okay.
So I was doing my training, which is another pressure that was kind of on my...
It's weird when a GP goes to a GP. Is that a weird thing, or is that just like...
No, it was. I felt a lot of worry about that because it's quite a small world. So, like, you're
quite
basically...
a heavy stigma on those kind of things.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
In the sense that I think doctors respect each other's confidentiality, but the reality is that I'm going to go to the local conference with all the local GPs, and one of them will know exactly what I'm going through.
Yeah.
And it's like dealing with that and knowing that they're going to know.
Okay.
And obviously this is a small area. So I actually used to be at this surgery before I then worked here.
Okay.
And I've since moved. And now I'm a patient at the surgery I used to work at. Okay. So there is that element of, I'm going to go get my sommelier from my mate, or like the embarrassment of it being someone you know.
That's right.
But then you have to kind of just get over that because it's important that you are well enough to do your job. So obviously that comes first. And so you have to just let it go.
We've got John Lee with us today again. I'm going to ask John to jump on the mic at some point. You should still be able to pick me up. So John's joining us again today. And John does mindfulness, and he's been doing some mindfulness for men courses as well.
Oh, I think I sent this to about 5 million patients.
Yeah, well, John was oversubscribed for that course. And actually one of the things he was indicating there is that some men are reluctant to show their face on the course. It's a Zoom-based course, like a Teams Zoom-based thing. And quite a lot of the men are reluctant to show their face. And there might be different reasons for that. Ultimately, what we've got to is that we want a culture where it doesn't matter who you are, where you are in any sort of level of seniority, or where you're, in the sort of structures of organisations. You should be happy to declare it, shouldn't you? There shouldn't be a culture of...
There's one of the things I always think about. It's to do with happiness, but it applies to everything. If you are kind to somebody, they are kind or kinder to 5 more people, who are kind or kinder to 5 more people, and it goes on to about 125 people. Yeah. And from a negative point of view, things like if I'm obese, not only is my friend likely to be obese, their friend who doesn't know me is more likely to be obese, because essentially we all influence each other. Mm-hmm. So I was thinking from the point of view of talking about mental health, if I'm totally honest about my mental health and I'm absolutely okay with it and I don't see myself as less as a person, then you don't see yourself as less as a person, then your mate who doesn't even know me doesn't see himself as less as a person. So I just think the more we talk about it, the more we open this up to being acceptable.
I agree. And I think you inspire others. That's basically the point, isn't it? It's like, the way I always think of it is like fear can spread very quickly. It's a very powerful emotion that can be used to manipulate and so on. But love, essentially, is about it's about self and those around us, and compassion is equally powerful. And I think that's basically what you're saying. It's like kind of, you have that self-compassion and that ability to share what you're going through. And if you share that with others, then it inspires that in them.
I think as well, to your point, another way to put it is you're kind of a moving average of like the 6 people around you or something.
Yeah.
Your 6 friends, you're an average of those 6 friends, roughly speaking, of course. Mm-hmm. But I think over the years, both of my parents suffered with mental health problems, and my sister did. And I think it's not contagious in terms of there's a pathogen or it's viral anyway, but I think mental illness as well, you inherit it to a degree.
40% is genetics.
Yeah, or even if it isn't genetic directly.
In environment as well.
Yeah, exactly. So you could, let's say you're adopted in, so there is no genetic link, and you come into a household and there's mental health problems in that household, I think that has a really big impact. So if you're friends with 6 people who all have mental health problems and you don't,
sure. I
think eventually it could be possible to develop that, whether it's the coping mechanisms you have or the energy, whatever it is, but yeah, I think it's a really important thing.
If you've got a parent with depression, you're twice as likely to develop depression yourself. Absolutely. Okay. That's in the mental health first aid referenced.
So 4 times as likely. And then 8 times as likely.
Exactly. So these things, they do compound, don't they? And they actually become multiple factors. It's like when you talk about suicide or mental health, there's many reasons, but there's no single like golden thread to it. There's no one thing we can tackle and that's going to reduce everything because it's complex, right?
There's many a time we'll go to schools or colleges or places like that, and everyone says, "Oh, we just never taught these skills at school." But from what I've heard just in the past 10 minutes, that was the most simplest bit of advice, I've heard so clear that anyone could teach this, being kind to 5 to another 5, and it just spirals.
Yeah.
That's just wonderful. It's just simple, isn't it?
Yeah. But I had a friend the other day who posted on Facebook about, he was at McDonald's, or he was about to order a coffee. Well, he ordered a coffee at the drive-thru, and then the person in front had paid it forward, so for the next person to get a coffee.
I love that.
And he'd never experienced it before, and he was like, "What's that about?" And it's like acts of kindness, and and it spread, and there was 55 kind of love this post, and obviously so exactly what you're saying. You literally see it happening on that post.
The first kind of event we did with Find the Light, it was beautiful. It was really open, and everyone, if they felt comfortable enough, obviously they would discuss their own mental health problems. Some people leaned back and just observed, totally fine. Some people left early, totally fine. But one of the guys who we spoke to, him and his wife said, his wife and their daughter, I believe, on Christmas Day, will pick up the phone book, go to 5 random names, pick one, and call up and say Merry Christmas and put the phone down. Because maybe they're alone. Maybe they don't have anybody on Christmas Day and that kind of thing. I'm enamoured with that kind of behaviour.
Yeah, small acts of kindness.
Yeah. But when you said it goes about 125 people, is there really kind of an upper bound on it? Is it a measurable thing that they've studied?
No, this is I was listening to this on a podcast that I love, and I think this was like from that one act that day, that's about how many people you will reach.
Oh, wow.
So it inspires me, because I think a lot of the time, we're talking about media, you can just feel like I am just a drop in the ocean and I cannot make a difference. But what this made me feel is you absolutely can. Like, we could get things better with grassroots projects. We could get things better by just being compassionate and actually seeing the other person as a human. And I don't know, it just makes me feel like I can inspired to try and help people. Do you know what I mean?
I put great stock in the power of conversation. You talk about Joe Rogan. Did you see the one with the guy called Daryl Davis?
No.
He's a black guy from the States, and he's a blues pianist. And he was in an international school, so obviously children of all ethnicities and all backgrounds.
Right, okay.
But he was in the South, and he'd go into blues bars, and he'd confronted by kind of clan members, real racism.
Right.
And I don't know how he did it. I don't know why he did it or how it came about, but he'd just sit and talk to them.
Yeah.
He'd sit and talk to them to the point where, without even trying, just saying, "You don't know me, get to know me."
Yeah.
He converted about 200 people to leave the clan.
Fantastic.
And there was one of the head, called the Grand Wizard.
Right.
It's the stupidest thing in the world, these titles. The lead dragon, whatever they're called. In Michigan, he spoke to the head muckety muck of the clan in Michigan and converted him. So from that point on, there was no more clan in Michigan. Like, the power of a good, heartfelt conversation sounds airy-fairy, but I put huge importance on things like that.
There's a study about psychological study where you set 2 people who are opposed up in a room, and they have to look each other in the eye and say nothing, but just maintain eye contact. And you've seen this play out, and it's like, and it actually was like, it was a black guy and a guy who had been actively racist and had been involved in like groups like the Klan and stuff. And the guy it takes about a couple of minutes, and the guy starts breaking down and sees this human stood in front of him. And again, back to your point about social media and versus face to face, and the outrage that you see on social media, you don't necessarily see reflected in real life sometimes, because it's just not the way people are.
Apparently, it comes a lot from, if you get your education directly from the generation above you, and you don't get outside education, that's where a lot of it dilutes. Like, there's a piece on Vice about how over the decades the problem with Daesh and Islamic State got more and more intensified. It was because you'd get you wouldn't get any schooling, no education, no outside influence. It would be the people directly above you in your family would tell you, and it would just dilute. It would condense over time. So it would get more and more
confirmation
extreme.
bias, isn't it? Like living in a bubble.
In your own echo chamber,
Yeah, absolutely.
I've got a question to ask Alex. So while we've been listening, I've heard compassion about 3 or 4 times. So where did you get that word from, or how did you learn what compassion is?
Good question. I do think that I'm naturally that kind of person. Like, we talked about hating horror films. Like, my husband laughs at me, but one of the reasons I hate it is, even if it's an absolutely abstract thing, people have been tortured or people have been murdered, and I can't help but go there mentally and put myself in that position. And he's like, but it's just not real. And I was like, yeah, but that has been real for somebody, and it makes me stressed, basically. So I think, you get people like sensitive people. I think even as a kid, I am totally one of them, and I find myself when I'm with a patient, like I'm putting myself in their shoes and I'm like imagining. So I think I'm naturally a little bit like that. Mm-hmm. And then obviously I've kind of gone down this rabbit hole of lifestyle medicine and absolutely love it. And the more you read about that and learn about it, like if a doctor shows you empathy, like you do have better health outcomes and compassion. Like it's insane. I think they did a study where they had people who had sexual abuse as a child, and they went to the doctors, and all the doctor had to say is, I noticed this happened to you and that shouldn't have happened and I'm really sorry. Would you like to talk about it? And even the people who said no had better health outcomes later on. Yes. Like it's because the person in a position of power had empathised with them and acknowledged that was wrong. Fantastic. So like if you can help, and there's loads of studies, isn't there, about people having cancer and like if they have a positive outlook, they do better. Like, I mean,
can I just summarise that back?
Sorry, go on. Yeah.
No, that's fantastic. So, a person like yourself, like a health professional, just to be able to recognise it, to acknowledge what they've said, validate it, and then offer them if they actually want to open up and talk about that. And of course, if it's trauma, it has to be volunteered. Of course, you can't force. But that act. And the difference it can make, the huge difference it can make to the feeling.
Does the medical system kind of eventually, under the pressures that you're under and the restrictions in place, is your approach kind of rare? Or does it eventually get kind of, not beaten out of people, but the pressure you guys get put under must be so extreme that I think, do those interactions become fewer and fewer?
Basically, I've had zero medical training in this. So there was absolutely zero at medical school about this whatsoever. Basically, when you were learning about the treatment for things, it'd be like, step 1, lifestyle. No details about what that was. Step 2, here's a list of drugs to learn and their side effects and everything else. Step 3, here's all the surgeries you could have and the anatomy. And basically, the focus is on those lifestyle was just like, you wrote that as the first thing in your box with no real, I mean, don't get it wrong. We know don't smoke and the basic stuff, but the actual, this stuff has all been something that I've kind of got into in the last maybe 7 years onwards. Wow. It started just with nutrition, ironically, because of my kids. I kind of wanted them to eat well, got really into nutrition, and then it snowballed from there to the other things of lifestyle. Yeah. So, like, we have, like, a teaching here every month, and I run it. And, like, I joke, like, we have a lifestyle section every time where we'll talk about something different in lifestyle that is influencing. And it's all news to them. And it's not because they're bad nurses or doctors. There's no teaching on it whatsoever.
Bring back compassion.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. One of the issues we have is we don't have a lot of time. So, like... What at the moment our system is, you have a phone call before someone comes in, and what I'm trying to do is things that are very simple, then I don't give them a lot of time, so that when I have somebody who really needs my time, I can give them more time. So I might have a 30-minute conversation, well really that's 3 appointments, but I will like curate my day to allow myself that time.
That's really interesting.
Well, it's fascinating because for me, so how do you develop compassion? So in the world of, say, mindfulness meditation, with prolonged practice, it starts to develop and activate those parts of the brain that are responsible for empathy and compassion. Okay. So it's like finding those moments in the day, whether it's, sitting and meditating or just being mindful with somebody. And so I'm hearing, just listening to somebody.
I think
there's something magic there, isn't it?
I think so, yeah. And it's something, we've discussed it before. By any other word, when I was in school, I was a bully. And it was because I had such crippling self-esteem issues. Because I was big, that was how I could be better than other people. Right. And it wasn't until
the best form of defence was attack.
Well, it wasn't even defence, it was superiority. It was self-imposed superiority, yeah. And it wasn't until I grew up and got past that the friends I got now, like, I can't ever imagine that being the case. But it wasn't until I grew up and realised maybe I was bullied, maybe I had trauma. It doesn't make it right. There's no justification for it. But I don't know what that tipping point was, because some people could, it's like if you're a child of an alcoholic parent, you can either abstain completely from alcohol or you might be an alcoholic yourself. Yeah. Where does that tipping point lie, and what does it look like? Where does intervention come into play?
And so with things like with mindfulness, it's kind of like, well, when at the point where you decide to make that decision, you actually engaging a part of your consciousness which is actually interacting with why would you be making that decision, and actually what does that represent that you're actually seeking something else, and then that's why mindfulness can be so powerful, I think.
Well, even the taking, Alex mentioned taking a wider perspective in the real world.
Yes.
Looking out there, that's exactly what happens with meditation. Taking your mind to a wider, spacious thing.
Yes.
And you're not necessarily on your own, you're part of something bigger.
Yeah.
With people especially, I think.
It's like they say, isn't it? You hold a pebble up close, it looks like a mountain. Hold it far away.
Yeah.
You know, you just get to see it in perspective, don't you?
I think it's worth noting, though. I think it, especially in the media and on social media in society, it's hard for compassion to flourish.
Mm-hmm.
In person, out in the world,
outrage and all that, everything.
Well, yeah, you're either in camp A or camp B. Like I said, you're not allowed to fall into the moderate space and actually learn what another person might be like or what they're going through. I feel like that's an environment in which it kills compassion, it kills good feelings, it kills positivity.
Yeah.
Take a step away from the computer.
I read about that element of what you get taught as a doctor and how much you get about like lifestyle and mental health, but it made it sound like what I'd read basically is that the emphasis is on pharmacology and surgery, basically surgical kind of procedures, as opposed to functional medicine, I think it's referred to, which is like the wider elements, and whether it's like, you know, like kind of, you said lifestyle, the choices we make as individuals and how they're expressed. And again, the example that always floats around in my head is when people are in a state of fear, and this is why I always use the example of fear, because we know from like studies that like placebos and nocebos is that there's a huge element, isn't there, in terms of like people's belief about something, and it can actually lead them to illness. So you know, positive mental attitude basically, and like learning like positive psychology can actually have a huge impact on your physical health and prevention.
But at what point does that come in? Like, those are the kind of things a doctor can't just necessarily say, I don't think. Just think better. Those are the kind of tools I think you need to have from a really, really early age. And get taught those coping mechanisms and that output, that approach, because sometimes I guess by the time people get to you, they might have learned some really unhealthy habits, and it's too late to do that kind of thing. Yeah.
I think the thing is often people need therapy, don't they? And that's the issue, that the availability of therapy at the moment is just terrible. Like the waiting lists are 9 months to a year. So if someone comes to you desperate and you think, you could do with some therapy, it's like, just sit tight for a year. You know, it's not realistic.
I wanted to come to that, actually. No, I mean, you mentioned, I think the thing is, I was going to say 9 months to a year is exactly what we're hearing at the moment. I've got to be careful what I say. I've asked a question recently about what's happening to those people who are on there, and there are meant to be other choices, other lifestyle pathways that they're offered in the meantime, and we're going to do a deep dive, like, professionally to try and understand more about that. But do those people end up coming back to you? So it's like, well, look, what am I meant to do? You know, do they advocate for themselves very well in that respect? Or
I think, to be fair, often they aren't necessarily identifying they need therapy. Often they're coming for medication, but I'm thinking therapy would be better for you. Right. But then that's an even harder sell if it's not going to be available in a timely fashion.
Agreed.
There is self-help things, but I think you have to be a certain level of wellness to do self-help things because you need your motivation. Right. So I think there's something called Live Life to the Full, which is like a CBT website. So I'll send them that. And often, if I have time, I will talk to them about exercise and explain the studies behind, as good as antidepressants and, like you say, mindfulness and even food. My husband, it's a running joke now. He says, I sit in time until you say microbiome. Because he's so sick of hearing it. Yeah. But the reality is that, I don't know, did you hear about the SMILES trial?
No.
Oh my God. It's going to blow your mind. They did this thing in Australia and they got people with moderate to severe depression. So this is not, this is people like really not unwell with depression, and they improved their diet. So they had two groups. It was a randomized control trial, the first of its kind for food. So one group just got like time with somebody who was supportive, because we know that makes you better anyway. So they wanted to control for the fact that they were going to be meeting with a dietitian, and the other group met with a dietitian, and it wasn't about losing weight or anything. It was about improving the quality of the food. So it was things like eating Mediterranean style diet and cutting out the processed food. Right. I think 30% of them went into complete remission. Wow. Because there's a massive part of depression that's inflammation. Yeah. So actually the people who don't respond to antidepressants often, it's because they're depressed because of inflammation. Yeah. And if you look at the way we eat at the moment, that's a big part of it. So it's like trying to, but then on the same note, if you're really down, even improve your diet, it's probably not what you want to hear. No, but then I also want people to have that knowledge, because you can't improve it if you don't know it's affecting your life.
Yeah. So it plays back into this. There's 100 different things you can do, which collectively add up to having, good mental well-being. And it's a good point in mind, because you can have a mental illness and have good well-being as well. So you can manage your mental illness But the reverse is true. So you can have mental illness and you can manage it really badly and just continue to spiral. Mm-hmm. And so the emphasis I'm very passionate about in my job and in my life, really, why we're sat here today, is that I think there's a lot more that people can do themselves that they don't. And at an earlier stage, if they're aware of that, they might just make those choices better. I think
we spoke about alcohol, didn't we, when I spoke to you before? And I've genuinely had somebody come to me for antidepressants who was drinking 70 units a week. Wow. And I was like, well, do you understand that every time you drink, the next day you will have less serotonin in your brain? And not only that, every time you drink, you will trash your sleep. Even if you're not drunk, you won't get that refreshing sleep. Like, essentially, you might not need antidepressants if you could just stop drinking.
Yeah.
Like, and it's like they haven't clicked that might be as good as an antidepressant. Yeah. So, like, I don't mind people drinking, but do it with the full choice. Yeah. Like, you know what the consequences are.
Right. Well, you're linking to something for me there. So, alcohol and drugs, let's say, but the ignorance involved. So they know it's wrong. They can listen to you and go, yes, she's right, but still don't cut down on it. It's like, is that ignorance?
You know what I think it is? Have you heard of Gabor Mate?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Trauma.
Yeah, so like everybody... pretty much everybody has some sort of like childhood trauma, and it doesn't have to be the things we think of about trauma. It could just be you didn't get quite enough attention, or your parents were busy, or maybe they had their own mental health problems, you know, and then you need a distraction from that pain. And it might be an acceptable distraction, like going on social media too much, or shopping, or whatever, or it might be an unacceptable one, like becoming a heroin addict or alcohol. So the reason they can't give it up is it gives them a momentary relief for when they're in pain. Okay. So unless they can understand that and change that or ride that feeling out until it passes, then the reward they're getting for that momentary moment of pain, that they're not going to be able to just give that up, because what's it going to be replaced with?
Yeah.
Is another name for that addiction?
Yeah, that's what his work is about. He basically says that we're all addicted to something, because when he does like teachings, he says who's addicted, and obviously like maybe one person puts a hand up, and then he says, well, my definition of addiction is something you do on repeat to distract yourself from your life. And it's like, okay, we're all addicted. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
There's a good book about trauma called The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah. My friend got me that for Christmas. I haven't read it yet.
I've dipped into it. My partner's read it. I've bought it from my partner. I haven't got fully into it. But yeah, and there's a new documentary out with Gabor Mate, leading, but he's absolutely I think pretty much the world's expert on trauma.
Check it out.
Like, brilliant.
But for me, it's sweets, ice cream and chocolate, and meat. I know, like, morally sat here in the cold light of day, I don't want to eat meat. Yeah. The factory farming process is vile. I don't want to be part of that. But I grew up eating meat, and I find it really hard to distance myself from that. And I know a lot of it. I've thought about what you said for a while. I get inflammation everywhere. My knees crack. It sounds like someone dropped a xylophone when I get out of bed in the morning. Everything clicks and cracks and crunches. And I know that's probably largely to do with my diet. But in those moments where I dip, chocolate makes me feel better.
Yeah.
It's a weird thing.
It's funny because I have exactly the same thing. Like I almost laugh at myself because I preach all the time about lifestyle and I'm overweight. And it's like, that's laughable, isn't it? I know everything, and yet I can't control myself. Like, because when I'm sad, that's my thing. Like, I'll comfort eat. Like, that's how I cope.
Yeah.
And it's very hard when you've got those habits formed. And also, like, my mum was the same sort of person, so I'm not just... Like, I've inherited it both environmentally and genetically. If you're sad, let's have some chocolate. You know what I mean?
There's again, fine line between balance and dependency, isn't there?
But that's how I was taught as a kid.
You know,
if I was sad, my nana would make me a cake.
Right.
It's that simple. It sounds daft. She was a proper old normal. Do you want a bit of cake, love? Yes, please, Nana. Right, give me 20 minutes. I'll make you one. Yes, Nana.
The thing is, I still do that. Like, I still haven't stopped. I've conditioned my children. Like, literally, my 3-year-old will fall over and be like, I need a sweetie to, like, help me. I'm like, oh, God, what have I done?
I'm hearing lots of stories like, it's happening in the moment, so this is what I'm going to do. And people coming to the surgery because I'm in this state, I'm in this position, so what can we do? My head's screaming out prevention. So how difficult is a preventative thought for an individual when we've got everything that you're talking about getting in the way? You know, chemicals, habits, things that we do just to make ourselves feel better.
This is why it has to be a community approach. Mm-hmm. Like, we can't wait until people are ill. Don't get me wrong, these things will help them, but like, I think we need to get in the schools, you need to get it, just from day one, you need to know about how to keep yourself well.
Mm-hmm. But if GPs aren't getting it, that information.
Yeah.
Because that should come as a shock to anyone listening, really, is that it's even now, again, it's covered in Adam Kay's, in his book and in the BBC serialisation of kind of what you get told and what you don't. And there's a doctor called Dr. Sam White who's been quite outspoken during COVID and so on. He's become like more functional medicine, and he had to fight the GMC about certain things that he shared, but he won that case. And he's saying he feels like he's almost up against big pharma in terms of kind of like...
It's really interesting.
It's really interesting. But I get the sense that there's something happening. There is a sense of something changing within the industry.
It's funny because so I'm quite a big fan of intermittent fasting and all the health benefits of that. So I often will tell patients about it. And I remember my husband saying to me, you need to be really careful,
right?
Like, because that's not guidance. And what if someone comes back to you? I mean, actually, they have now made it guidance. So I feel like I've got a little bit of backup. But again, it's what you're saying, like, if you wait for the research papers to come into the guidance, you might miss 10 years where you could
100%,
help people.
100%. Normally, like the type of research, there's a network in the north called Fuse, which is the Fuse network, which is about I guess the idea of it is really to convert research faster into practice. And I remember reading at one point it was like 7 or 8 years on average, to sort of get that into practice. But the truth is that the evidence of functional medicine existed well before just pharma was seen as the big solution. And I want to pick up, because you mentioned there that a lot of people come in asking for medication. So the barrier is immediately there, straight away, that people are coming in, I'm guessing that is expressed as I want some antidepressants, or I've used them before, they worked for me then, or a family member's used them and I'd like to try these. Is that how it comes across, or is it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, a lot of it is, if you think about why do you go to the doctor, because actually people probably don't come for advice.
Right.
I personally feel like they don't come for advice. They come because they want a tablet. Even if you come with a bad chest, if you think you've just got a cold, I'd like to think you don't come to the doctors. You come because you think you've got pneumonia and you want antibiotics. Do you see what I mean? So I think if they've come with their mood, it's often because they're at the point where they feel like they need, I had time off work, which was fair enough, or they need an antidepressant.
Okay.
So I think we're seeing that subset of people who've decided that that's what they need at this moment. And when they are still feeling like they can do lifestyle stuff, if they know about it, then they haven't come to us yet.
I think one of those things, though, is you go to the doctor once the problem has arisen, and you don't pick up your addictions or your unhealthy habits from the doctor. You're a product of your environment. So in order to have that preventative aspect and that intervention, the environments have to change. Do you think that's fair to say? It's nothing to do with the doctors at that point. It's how people, I don't want to go back to raise their kids, but how they communicate with each other, how they teach each other, how they learn from one another, the messages you give people.
I can't remember. I think was the World Health Organization said something like basically mental health is a social problem. Like anxiety and depression is a social problem because a lot of the factors that make you mentally ill are actually social issues like unemployment, all these other things. We need to address those things if we really want to get things better.
And we are spiralling. I mean, take the last tip. What have you noticed over, how long have you been practicing as a
GP? I've been a partner here for 5 years, but obviously I did my training, I basically left medical school in 2009. And then did GP training, I can't remember now. I did a couple of years in hospitals and then went into GP training. So that's, can't work that out.
That Adam Kay book, like, puts it well into perspective in terms of what you have to put yourself through to become a doctor, and kind of, and it's, everything thinks doctors get paid great, and then when for the vast majority of those training years, you ain't, and it's actually very hard work. You're putting 70 hours a week in and possibly more, and it's thankless really, isn't it? So thank you for doing it and getting through it, and congratulations.
People seem to, sorry to cut you off, people seem to forget the nobility that goes into that kind of thing. Right. And people see the doctor as, they're not giving me what I want, they're not saying this, they're not doing that. But the sheer altruism that it would take to become a doctor, I couldn't do that.
Yeah, well, it's when you said about the training, I remember being asked to go into Teesside Uni for doctors in training and do a presentation about mental health and well-being. And I was like, what? Me? Like, I just work in health improvement. I was thinking, surely this is just something that's part of the modules anyway.
So does that mean we lack in compassion?
Yeah, we lack compassion.
Do men need more compassion?
Right.
It's funny, actually. I mean, slightly off point, but basically people think if you're a doctor, you know everything. Like, everything. Like, when I had my first baby, it was the first baby in my family, so I didn't have any nieces or nephews. And every time the health visit came, she'd be like, but you know everything, you know all that anyway. And I was like, no, please tell me. Like, they didn't tell me how to raise a baby. Yeah. That wasn't part of the course. Yeah, right. There's just an assumption that, oh, well, obviously you know what you're doing. It's like, of course I don't.
Well, that's a dangerous belief structure to have, isn't it? Is that we put so much into one person's profession that we think they do know everything. That's kind of a scary thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
But the GP, the nature of GP, of course, is it's a family. You're a family doctor, aren't you? You are expected more than other doctors who are specialists.
Yeah. To
know, this wider definition of health issues. So that's a pressure that comes with it, isn't it? I guess.
Yeah, and one of the questions I was thinking to ask is, obviously you're talking about the NICE guidelines coming out, and there's some very, very good. We can sit here and talk about it and advocate for, positive changes in other aspects of your life. Obviously, in an ideal world, that would be great. How realistic do you think it would be to put that into practice as a GP for the system? Do you think it's actually a GP or a medical responsibility, or do you think it's information that has to be passed around outside?
As in us to signpost, or do you mean deliver it, or?
Well, how realistic it would be to actually put it into practice and give people that information of, like you said, dietary things, exercise. Should that be done way before it even gets to the medical side?
I should just summarise. The new guidelines have been getting reviewed for about 7 years now. And it looks like this year for the NICE guidelines for depression are going to be issued. But the emphasis, pharma appears to be pushed down the list. I think for some people not enough, but certainly like a variety of specific therapies followed by like lifestyle, looking at people's wider well-being is going to come before pharmaceutical solution. Although I think most people's position would be there's a place for all of it. It's just that it's in the order of how that plays.
The other thing is those have to be there. So like it's all very well saying therapy first.
Right.
If there's no therapy to be had, like, because this is the hilarious thing about guidance. Like, I have a vivid memory. So this is more than 5 years ago when I went to like a teaching session basically for new GPs or ones that are about to qualify. Right. And they were doing like, from now on, we're not going to do exercise stress tests anymore, which is where you run a treadmill with an ECG. It's going to be this fancy pants CT scan, where you'll be able to see calcium buildup, and it's more accurate to look for basically angina. Okay. So then the next day when I was like at my job, I was like, all right, I've got someone. So like, how do we refer for this CT? And my supervisor was like, what? And we're still doing exercise stress test now, 5 years later. Like, so that guidance came out. I don't know why we haven't, but there isn't one.
Right.
So we're still doing what we were doing before. So they can bring the guidance out, but if they don't put in place enough therapy and enough things, then it won't change practice because we won't have any choices about how we do it.
That brings us, or me at least, directly onto something we were talking about earlier. When you talk about these things, they might work, but whether you get them as an option to prescribe or use is a different matter.
Yeah.
There's a lot of evidence that suggests things like THC is good for depression in certain circumstances. And I only found out this morning from you that it's actually been not legalized, but put into license for medical treatment.
Yeah. So you can prescribe it. I understand.
Is that something that you have ever prescribed or could prescribe? Have you got that option?
No, I think it's a secondary care drug only. So
what does that mean? Sorry.
So we have like 3 different types of medicines. You've got normal medicines, anyone where we can prescribe green. You have amber, which we can only prescribe in working with a hospital specialty. So it'd be things like methotrexate for rheumatoid arthritis. They would have to be under a specialist, be stabilised, and once all of that is done, we would be allowed to prescribe it, but only with the monitoring they say and a contract between us and the hospital. Okay. So and then there's red drugs only from the hospital. Okay. So we couldn't, even if we wanted to, we could not prescribe them. And I think it's a red drug.
Okay.
So I think we could not do it even if we. And frankly, I don't personally have the experience, and we've had no teaching on it. I know there's 2 elements, isn't there? There's the THC, and then there's the other one, which I can't remember.
CBD.
There you go. See, exactly. So I'm definitely not in a position to.
Psychoactive, one is not psychoactive.
There's a lot of interest in it. I know there's also a lot of interest in mycelium, in essentially magic mushrooms. Yeah, and there was a fantastic. There's a what's he called? He was the drug czar for the Labour government, for Blair's government. David Nutt, Professor David Nutt, he's called, and he does a drugs podcast. Drugscast, I think it's called. Something like that. Anyway, you'll be able to find Professor David Nutt, and they did. Yeah, they've him with a colleague have led this research around it for depression, and it was specifically around people who hadn't responded to all the different treatments they'd been offered, and it was almost instantaneously effective for about 2 or 3 months for the majority of them that went through it. And it was obviously very special. While they were taking this quite significant dose, they were being counselled, and there was very specialist kind of training obviously going on while they were doing it, because it could be quite a dangerous situation for someone if it wasn't managed properly. But it ultimately allowed the trauma to flow and them to talk about it and really let out a lot of this kind of emotion, trauma that they'd carried.
Does that say then from what I understand from that, it's used as a tool for therapy as opposed to just a thing that you would have on your own?
So it might be something.
I think it was like guided, wasn't it? It was guided trips, basically, isn't it? And then the people who were stuck in a certain mindset because of what it does to your brain, they could get out of those loops of that destructive mindset and make other connections and see the bigger picture.
As well, didn't they?
It's an MDMA for veterans particularly as well. It's just interesting because
LSD as well. Sorry,
the theme is demonised treatments that can't be. Well, that haven't traditionally got like the history in pharmacology, are actually starting to come back to the fold again, for mental health, and it's just interesting, the what's out there. But again, it's back to one thing isn't going to be kind of like the treatment for everything, basically.
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought it would ever be kind of revolutionary in terms of it would replace the current system, but if it could ever help people, then it's a shame that it wouldn't, because it's clearly illegal for no good reason.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
I've got a question for Alex, if you don't mind.
No, please.
And back onto the subjects of men's health. Do you talk to men differently when they come to you?
That's a good question.
And if you do, what is it that you do? Or how do you do it?
I probably don't talk to them differently, but I think I probably bring up the subjects of like stress and those other things, whereas I think often women will openly say I'm under a lot of stress, whereas I will say to them, well, one of the things that makes this worse is stress. Like, is there anything going on at the moment? So I had a guy the other day who was having horrendous migraines, and I kind of said, well, one of the reasons migraines get worse is stress. And he was like, oh, well, I'm going through a few. He didn't really want to talk about it, but he said, I've got a few things going on. And then like a week later, he was down because he's basically had like a mental health breakdown because actually he was going through a really horrific divorce. Right. And then we had another conversation and I thought, yeah, well, that's why your migraines were terrible. I would also have terrible migraines if I was going through this amount of pressure.
That's right.
So I think men often come with a physical problem, and the actual underlying thing is a mental health problem.
So that's in the evidence for men's health, particularly from the Centre of Men's Health, which used to be in Leeds, was that men don't necessarily they're not always the best advocate in a healthcare like transactional conversation. They'll sit there and sort of do the I'm okay, and you'll have to. But you said I don't really do it very differently, but I think you do, because it's almost like you're saying something to make it safe for them. You're asking them specific questions to try and get them to open up. And it sounded like what you were saying is that women are more likely to describe that up front.
I think it's more acceptable, isn't it, for women to express mental health issues. And I think also, no offence, but women are better expression in general.
Yeah.
I think we have so many more words than men by a certain age. And there's also a thing about friendships, isn't there? I'd read something that if you get little kids, so like 3, 4, 5, boys and girls will talk about their friends like they love them, and like if they'd die if they weren't there, and like lots of like love terms. Yeah. And then as they get older, the boys stop using those terms because what they've realised is that's not acceptable to talk like that, whereas the girls continue to use them because it is acceptable. So I think girls just have more doors open to them to get support without being judged, whereas I don't think men do.
And the men I've worked with or known, it's at that point when they realise that is the key to the door to open up to start finding some solutions, is when the Brené Brown principle of being more comfortable with your shame and your vulnerability. And that's really what it's about, isn't it? It's admitting that they're vulnerable in some way, that they can't cope themselves.
I never put 2 and 2 together until you said that before, though. But I guess a lot of what we do is undoing those kind of restrictions. Do you know what I mean? I'd never thought about it before, but we have to tell people, have to tell men. We don't have to, but what we do is let men know it's okay to not be okay. That classic thing. And
the stigma is very real anyway for mental health, isn't it? And but overcoming that for men is an even greater.
That's what I mean. I think the task is undoing those, taking the walls down, so to speak. When you see men who are presenting, does it start with describing back pain, or you mentioned there about a gentleman describing he was having headaches and was it? I think you said
migraines.
Migraines, right? And so Is that often the case with men? Is it comes as something else?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, men do that for a lot of things, actually, not just mental health.
Right.
You know, you spend your 10 minutes you've got with them talking about their toenail, and then on the way out, like, P.S., I've got rectal bleeding. You're like, oh, okay, come back in. You know, because they've been building themselves up to say the big thing that they want to say. Wow. But I think definitely with mental health, I mean, life has changed since COVID, so I think people have had to be more direct. So I think I mentioned to you, we've got this e-consult system, and what I'm finding is men are more honest on that than they were in person, not on an online form.
Online.
Yeah. So you answer a series of questions. So if you say it's mental health, it will ask you, like, are you suicidal? Are you, you know, obviously goes through all the sort of questions we would ask. And often they'll admit to things that I don't think they would admit in person. So, like, they'll admit, like, I think I've got an issue with codeine, or I think, you know, things, because it's on a piece of paper. Okay. And then when they ring up, you'd think the person you're speaking to is a different person. And I'll say, well, on that form you mentioned, you know, you're feeling suicidal. And then they'll talk about it. But it's like, I had to have the form. Do you see what I mean? I do see it. Yeah, so actually for men, I think that's been great.
That's fascinating.
So, yeah, that's process,
isn't it? Just
and not emotion, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it's like engineering.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have to wrap up soon.
Yeah, sorry.
It's quite okay. I did have one question. I don't want to end on a really deep, dark note.
But you are.
I'll throw joking at the end. I read this morning, it was a question I was going to ask around the levels of mental illness in your profession.
Mm-hmm.
And I read this morning actually a really shocking statistic whereby suicide rates amongst doctors are between 2 and 5 times that of the general population. Obviously, I've never expected you to out your profession, but does that ring true? Is it common? How common is mental illness amongst doctors?
I think it's really common.
Okay.
Really common, because we're under immense pressure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a little bit like men, I suppose it's not acceptable to be mentally unwell. The other thing is the NHS has been running understaffed for years. Mm-hmm. So if, let's say I call in sick, nobody's coming to cover me.
No.
Like, those patients are being cancelled. And not only those patients being cancelled, everyone you work with is going to have a really tough day. Yeah. So, like, mentally, you're like, I have to just suck it up and get on with it. Same with the wards. Do you know what I mean? Like, the wards are running with like 3 doctors less than they should be. So if you don't turn up, it starts to get dangerous for the people who are there. Course, so you just go in, even though you're not really fit for it. Yeah. And that's like, it's seen as like the badge of honour to be exhausted. And also, not so much in GP, luckily. But if you look at the hospital doctors, they not only do they have to work those kind of crazy shifts with those pressures, they need to be taken off certain procedures and certain things that they've done. Mm-hmm. They do that in their own time. If it doesn't come naturally, if you don't get it signed off, you're not going to be able to continue training. Mm-hmm. So you'll stay back and you'll do an operation. You'll stay back and you do the ward round even though you've just done a night shift.
How safe is it doing an operation after a grueling 16-hour exhaustive shift?
It's funny, I had this chat with someone, like, when I had my 2 children, like, honestly, they just never slept. I remember coming into work and thinking, at what stage do I say, I'm not fit to work? Like, I haven't slept. You know, but on the same note, my children aren't going anywhere, so I can't just not work. It's very, you know, and I've seen me with morning sickness, you know, excuse myself, go and puke and come back and finish my clinic, because it's just that sense of obligation that you don't want to let people down.
Of course. And that brings on another question of what is in place for doctors? What resources, what services, what tools?
There's quite a lot in place, to be fair. Obviously, we have our own GPs and we are people. So we go through all the normal channels. There's also like the local medical councils. If you feel like you're struggling, you can approach them for support. Mm-hmm. They have been putting on some mindfulness things for NHS workers, and obviously you can access that. Yes. And I think during COVID, not just doctors, but for NHS staff, you could get a fast track for CBT online. Awesome. And I know a couple of doctors who took them up on that, and it stopped them having to wait a year for therapy. So there is things out there. Okay. But I think it's whether you're happy to be open about the fact that you're struggling.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, it's just one more.
Yeah, sorry.
I know that, no, not at all. There's two. I'll roll into the one question, but one is about pathways. So, and one is if you could wave a magic wand to make things better. What do you? And you've mentioned sort of these things need to happen probably earlier before people land in the GP. But what is that? What's missing in terms of your experience of what you would prefer to have available to make things better?
I would love therapy to be like a 3-week wait or
ramped up.
Yeah,
ramped
just
up capacity therapies.
Because even one of the things that's really hard about therapy as well is that, like, because it's such there's so few resources that even people who could deal with therapy, if they're still functioning, it's like, well, actually, you're too well for therapy. So we basically wait until people are really sick. Like, it just seems so stupid to me. But because if you went higher up on the ladder, you wouldn't have enough resources.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So it just really annoys me.
That's right. And you mentioned about schools earlier on and why we don't do more of this in schools. Resilience and like well-being and looking after yourself and the relationship between diet and mental health and all this kind of thing. What we are saying is more of that. We have a program in the South East called Head Start that go in and do work, particularly around transition, like those difficult transition years, like 6 to 7 and so on, and making sure that they're better prepped and basically building something called on a model called the Resilience Framework. There's some really like positive results from that. There's a flip side, like there is to everything. Everything has like increasing the awareness of mental health possibly has also had an impact on kind of self-diagnosis, and where anxiety is something which can be a healthy emotion, like can be a warning sign to us that something isn't right. Equally, it doesn't necessarily mean you're ill. You know, it can be an experience that we all have worries, but it's whether or not if you just because you experience worries and you aren't happy all the time. When people then self-diagnose and say, well, there must be a problem. And there's that flip side. I always wonder if you ever see anyone who actually you go, I'm not really sure. I think they're overcooking it. I think they're overthinking it. Kind of.
I mean, often, like with those people, I would be talking about lifestyle stuff and I wouldn't be talking about other things, like the mild depression or mild anxiety. The first thing, I mean, anxiety in general, therapy and lifestyle works better anyway. And I'll say that to them. Like the studies show that if you've got anxiety, then this is going to get you better quicker than, tablets.
Like physical activity.
Yeah. And so I guess I just would be focusing on that with them, because often I teach medical students actually, and often I'll say to them, like, yes, it's about giving options, but your job as the person who has the information is to weight the option to the most appropriate one.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So for those people, I would be having a weighted conversation towards lifestyle and those things first.
Fantastic. There is again, so it'd be a case of, like, from your point of view, where you're sat, where you get people coming in, faster referral to like therapies would be like what you'd like to see. In terms of the pathways, I think we'd like to see more kind of clearer options for GPs to refer out into the community. Like you said there, like the community approach clearly is something which might prevent a lot of people even ending up within your surgery. The worrying statistic to me is that about 70% of the people who decide to complete suicide aren't even known to health services. They've never even engaged with any services, and it's a case of, that they might have been drinking. It's often a quick decision, in terms of people doing that. But that's quite disturbing, isn't it? That they're not even in the system.
I think that's why it has to be a public health message.
Yes. And
like, basically we should be talking about health, the pillars of health: sleep, diet, exercise and relaxation.
Where's all that been during the last 2 years, by the way? It hasn't been, that's it.
No single thing has a bigger impact on mental health than sleep. It is the single greatest thing. If I don't sleep properly, I'll just tank, and if I sleep fine, I'm great.
It's also like, because I'll say it to my kids as a performance enhancer. Like Usain Bolt, when he broke the world record, he just woke up from a nap. Like, it's like the best free performance enhancer ever. And not just physical performance, like mental performance.
Didn't he have a lot of fish fingers as well?
Did he?
Yeah.
I don't know. I didn't hear that.
He's one of those freak athletes, apparently, eating like chicken nuggets and stuff. Had a nap and then got up and broke the world record. So, to your point, it could be the sleep, but it could be the chicken nuggets.
Are you saying there's a correlation between chicken nuggets and running?
All I know is I eat a lot of chicken nuggets and I put on a lot of strength, so who knows?
And on that bombshell.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Johnson.
I think we probably could have talked for 3-4 hours.
I told you. I did warn you. I can't shut up.
Maybe we will come back to you in the future and some like single issues in a bit more detail as well. That'd be fantastic.
I'd love to.
But in the meantime, obviously, if you get any men through the GP, let them know about Borough Man Can and
I have been
services that are happening locally. And in fact, I think you made a couple of referrals to the men's mindfulness, didn't you?
Lots.
Fantastic. So we need more options, don't we?
Definitely.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Thank you, Alex.